Track 9, Spiritual Maturity and Righteous Living. I want to tell you that applying this scripture to your daily life is what matters. James 2:24 tells us that, quote, a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone, end quote. So today's topic is on spiritual maturity and righteous living. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teachings about righteousness, but solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. Hebrews 5:12-14. Therefore rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. 1 Peter 2 verses 1-3. Peter says that you can grow up in your salvation after you have tasted that the Lord is good. I think that your assurance will also grow the more you realize that the Lord is good. I've heard it said that salvation simply comes from a miraculous one-time occasion. However, Psalm 34:8 says, taste and see that the Lord is good. For we must taste and then we see. It is like how my pastor always reminds me to look back and see how far God has brought me. I want to discuss Hebrews 5:14 regarding the distinguishing good from evil. As I've said, we distinguish good from evil by the 6 o'clock news. It's easy to watch and say, this is good and this is evil. But I think Scripture reminds me of constant improvements I can make, and it's hard to recognize my own good and evil. This book has been about finding assurance of salvation. Peter tells us in both 1 Peter 1 verses 3-11 and 2 Peter 2 verses 1-3 that we are to continue growing in knowledge. On the topic of righteous living, I would recommend reading Colossians 3. The following is a section from that chapter. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived, but now you must rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its Creator. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace. And be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly, as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your heart. Colossians 3, 1-2, 5-10, and 12-16. Again, I don't know when someone is saved, but as James 2:24 tells us, it's not just about faith, but by what we do. Using the hard words of Paul, let us put to death these old passions and desires, sexual thoughts, porn, the love of money, and possessions, which is greed. I wish churches taught on these verses. True faith is not simply believing in Jesus Christ, but believing in this message. Jesus Christ freed me from so much, and with those former passions gone, I get to work on the other things such as anger, rage, malice, slander, and foul language. We are to clothe ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. None of us will be perfect, but by the grace of God, we don't have to be. Sadly, I fear that too often we get comfortable in that grace and don't seek out the true joy of God. My wife knows that I struggle. I struggle with my anger and my language when frustrated. And I realize how harmful these things are to me and my relationships with others. So I seek God to calm my spirit. My friend who works in prison hears all sorts of language from the inmates, and he tells me that some of the guards he works with use the same language back at the inmates. How foolish. That's quite literally drinking the same poison. Jesus tells us that what goes into the body doesn't make us unclean, but what comes out of the mouth, because it comes from the heart. So today's prayer is on dealing with this hardness of heart, dealing with foul language, dealing with constant hunger for more money and possessions, which is greed, or dealing with sexual addictions and habits. Faith and prayer are great, but as James 2:24 says, they need to be accompanied by action. In the next chapter, I will share my story and the steps I took to overcome the same habits that Paul addresses.